All right, we are now live for the AMA for March 2025. So many months and years go by. I got to think about which one we're actually in sometimes. And, you see me here in my office as usual at the Global Water Center. So we've already got a few questions lined up. Feel free to ask whatever questions you want to, and I will try to get to them. You don't have to ask questions multiple times. It takes a while to get through the questions that we have. So here is the first one from Andolivia. Your Montaigne video on liars got me wondering, are there any works you particularly recommend reading in the age of Trump? And my initial response would be no more than in any other age, because it's not as if, this is a unique situation that we're in. It's just that Trump happens to lie much more frequently than most other politicians do. You're going to be hard pressed to not find a politician who bends the truth in any way whatsoever. But he's pretty egregious, and his administration is pretty given to lying. But, is this a new situation that we're in? I mean, he was in charge for 4 years before. So it's interesting because a lot of people bought books like, for example, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is a very, interesting work, but extraordinarily dense. And I think that most of the people who bought those books became a bestseller again. Didn't actually read them because, it's a difficult work. I mean, you could certainly peruse literature about lying, but I think it's more important to think about what the effects of lying are over time, and why people are attracted to the kinds of lies that are being told. So, for example, I'm sure somebody will ask a question about this. The whole world has seen the interplay between Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and Donald Trump and his sidekick Vance going after him in the Oval Office. And Trump can't tell the truth to save his life, and Vance is pretty clearly a huckster as well. And we know what the situation is, and but there's plenty of disinformation out there, and it's interesting to see just how many people on the right need to spin this so that it's a win for them, when the rest of us looked at it and we're like, wow, new low for them, you know. And so you might want to think about why people need lies to sustain their life, and the corrosive effect that telling and believing lies over and over again has on a person's character. So I think there's some philosophical works that could be helpful. Augustine has two interesting kind of small treatises that have to do with lying. Plato talks about, this, Aristotle talks about it, but not in quite as thematic of a way. And, so we could think about why people need lies in order to function, and what's wrong with deception, and how does it damage a person's character. So I think that's basically all I would have to say about that. Here's another interesting question from Miguel. In your view, what makes a good philosopher good and a bad one bad? Do you have favorite examples of particularly good and bad philosophers? So I don't have like overall criteria that I've laid out for like who's a good, who's a bad. It's more of a, situational kind of thing. And I think a lot of philosophers may be good in some respects and bad in others. I would say, part of it has to do with whether you can follow, complex lines of reasoning that aren't your own and make sense of them. when I run into people who, and I get emails from people like this, and occasionally like messages and other formats, who think that they've got like everything figured out and they want me to read their grand theory of everything. They usually turn out to be cranks and kooks, and they haven't read enough other stuff. And actually, that would be one thing I could say. Take Ludwig Wittgenstein, for example. I've said this, many times, that he's a very interesting guy, but he really would have benefited by reading more widely and attentively in the history of philosophy. He read some Spinoza, he read some Schopenhauer, he read some other stuff, but he wasted a lot of his time and his readers and interlocutors' time, basically, replicating wheels, and not even that effectively, by not reading people who'd come before him. He gets Augustine's theory of language wrong. And he doesn't take into account what's going on in linguistics and semiotics and stuff like that, which was readily available to him if he wanted to check it out. Now, does that make him a bad philosopher? No, it makes him somebody who didn't measure up to his potential, you could say. I would say that being, obstinate about things in fairly superficial ways, like being on, Team Hegel or Team Stoic or stuff like that. People who are into that usually don't know what they're talking about. So that makes them not very good at doing philosophy, because it's not a team sport, it's a different kind of activity. And I like people who, so we brought up Montaigne a little bit earlier. I like people who can read other people and have kind of a measured, proportional response to it. They can be like, yeah, I like these things about what Plutarch is saying here, but I think he's wrong about this. So, being able to make distinctions rationally is certainly an important part of it. But I don't have a great answer to that one. All right, Max. Good to see you here, Max. Don't have a question yet. Thanks for your work. You're very welcome. Here's a longer question by Mark. If Nietzsche's concept of transvaluation of values has taken place, and if Christian morality has influenced civilization, why do we still see large-scale violence and aggression? One would expect that with the shift in values, violence would decline. Is this because the will to power is insuppressible, or is there another explanation? Yeah, sure, there's another explanation. Things are way more complicated than one line, takes on human history like that, right? It's not as if, herd morality is incompatible with violence taking place, right? It just approaches violence in different ways. I mean, I think that you could look at different interpreters of Nietzsche in the 20th century who are often quite critical of him as well, and see them using these sorts of ideas. I mean, you could say that with herd morality, people sometimes like fall into an orgy of violence, and then they feel bad about it afterwards, or they engage in or support violence, which is going to happen, and deplore it, keep it at arm's length. You could think about, for example, how we punish criminals here in the United States. We still execute people, but we hide it away as something shameful. We don't have public executions typically anymore. And where does that come from? Maybe it comes from the transvaluation of values, but I don't see the big incompatibilities here. Let's see here. Gurkham says, what do you think gamified side of life, or gamification of life, or life is literally a game? I also believe economic determinism that is like a game mechanics. Well, I mean, you can believe in that if you want to, but I mean, I don't know why you would any more than you would buy into some other big ism that you can't possibly prove. you know, I mean, but that's your choice. So I've been thinking a lot about gamification lately. And I think that, like in academics and in other parts of life, people have been making an argument for about 2 decades that, what we need to do is gamify things because that will, help learners be more engaged and all that. And I actually think, again, this is in order to provide an argument and evidence for this, I'd have to do a lot more work that I'm going to do here. But here's my knee-jerk response. Gamification has overall been a bad thing. Why? Because it's introduced these categories that then become habitual for a lot of people that act as blinders for them. So, one example of this is, when you look at fiction, there's lots and lots of discussions out there about fantasy or sci-fi or stuff like that. And they want to talk about, does this person have this sort of power level or this sort of power level? That comes straight out of games. And that is intellect eroding stuff. So like they'll talk about, hey, in Tolkien's Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, is the Balrog more strong than Sauron or Gandalf? Which power level are they at? And you're like, you've totally missed the point, buddy. If that's the way you're thinking about stuff, then you're kind of missing a lot of what goes on. You're not paying attention to the literature, and I think that the need to like jockey for position and feel like you're making progress, I think that's actually been kind of a bad thing for people overall. It distracts from actually getting on with the work of like improving your mind or enjoying some speculative fiction and thinking about things. It introduces a lot of unnecessary competitiveness and envy and comparison between people. And it tends to promote categories that are not that applicable to a lot of matters. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to think about this from like a Heideggerian point of view, this would be like the very end. Gamification would be the very end of the technological approach to things that conceals the reality of stuff. It winds up covering things over, and it produces a sort of mentality, and it pervades a lot of people's life. Dating gets treated in a gamified way, and if you do that, you're basically guaranteeing that you're going to be a superficial and lonely person throughout your life. Because so it's basically applying categories that within their own area just fine, right? So gamifying a game, that's great, right? Gamifying your spiritual development, gamifying your education, gamifying your romantic life, probably a stupid way to approach things, and it's going to have, just like we were talking about how lying has a corrosive effect on people. I think that too much emphasis on and I'm not saying all games are bad or anything like that, but treating things in what we call gamification can actually be quite bad for people. All right, so let's see here. Zaina says, do you have a special Stoic blueprint in a concise way that makes people less addicted to their smartphones and texts? No, why would you need a special, and by the way, it's Stoic is uppercase S. We often distinguish between lowercase s, which is just like the disposition and stiff upper lip, and then the actual philosophy is Stoicism. But why the hell you don't need Stoic philosophy to make you less addicted to your smartphone. All you need is a little bit of common sense and realizing that, hey, if you're addicted to something, treat it the same way you treat addiction to anything else. You got to look at your habits. You got to actually make choices at important points to not indulge in that. I mean, you got addicted to your cell phone because you picked it up multiple times a day and let apps draw you in. Why not take some control over that? I mean, you don't have to be a Stoic. You could be an Aristotelian or an Augustinian or anything. You could be a Cartesian and be like, that's probably not good for me, right? You want to have some control over your life. Well, use the bit of control that you have and exert that, and you'll slowly build it up more, right? So, all right. Yeah, I figured we'd have quite a few questions about Trump and all these people. And so this one is about, this is from Marco. Do you find Trump's and Musk's behavior sadistic? Strikes me they very much enjoy threatening thousands of public employees, making people feel existentially threatened and insecure. Yeah, I think that Trump and Musk and people who like them and praise them and vote for them, although nobody voted for Musk, it kind of tagged along, right? I think that there is a cruelty and sadism that is part of their character, and it stems from being deeply insecure. And it's interesting as people, there's a lot of discussion today about masculinity. And you look at Trump and you look at Vance or Musk, and you're like, these guys are wusses. There's nothing masculine about them. And you got all these MAGA types who are like, hey, real men time, daddy's back in town. And you're like, wow, you guys are wimps. Like any guy who has to brag that much about how tough they are, they're not a tough guy, and they're bullies, and bullies like to hurt people. Why? Because by pushing somebody else down, they get to feel good about themselves, because they don't feel good about themselves because they know they're pieces of crap, in real life. And, you look at Trump, failed businessman who has defrauded basically anybody who's worked with him in the past. He's cheated and defrauded them. You'd have to be an idiot to think that somebody like that is not going to keep doing that. Look at Musk. Musk is deeply exploitative. I know he's the darling of a lot of tech boys, but I mean, that just shows you how dumb a lot of tech boys are, how easily suckered they are. You should be looking for role models that are actually decent people who can engage with other human beings like they're other human beings, And yeah, I mean, sadistic is one way of describing it. Bullies, deeply corrupt, everything is transactional, hollow people who have really nothing to offer other than a bunch of lies, and managed to get a lot of other damaged people suckered in and thinking that it would be a good idea to put these idiots in charge. I mean, not that the Democrats are great, but at least they kept the lights on. These guys, they just want to go in and break things. And, whether they're doing it for the benefit of Russia directly, like is Trump a Russian agent or not, there's debate about that, or whether they're just, useful idiots, as they call them. They're certainly working for the benefit of enemies of everything that's decent about liberal democracies. So, all right, philosophuncalist. I feel sorry for the people of Ukraine. Hark the philosophy of war. Yeah, I mean, this is bad. Hopefully, we will see a couple things happen. If America wants to retreat into MAGA isolationism and corruption for a decade or two, and destroy the alliance systems that we built up, and lose all the goodwill that we accumulated over about 70 years, maybe we'll see the Europeans step up and form some sort of defense thing. I mean, it's clear that Russia is a deeply corrupt, totally damaged culture and nation that is trying to prey on, Ukraine, Georgia, all sorts of places all over the world. And it's clear that the Russian people aren't going to be able to depose the tyrant who is in place currently. And there's probably nobody good who's going to replace him when inevitably Putin dies. But somebody's going to have to deal with that. And, if America wants to make stupid decisions in terms of who we allow to be our leaders, there's nothing that says that we have to stay on top. We're a pretty hollowed out nation right now, and a lot of the decisions that are being made are pretty stupid and are going to come back to bite us. And not supporting Ukraine is kind of, that's a no-brainer. Who should we be supporting in that case? We should be giving them as much support as possible to fight against, outright aggression. But, a lot of Americans seem to think that it's cool not to. All right. Now we get something directly philosophical. In Aristotle, this is from Kelly. In Aristotle's view of akrasia, how does Aristotle assign culpability for mechanisms underlying akrasia's different dimensions of ignorance of right reason? He doesn't. That's something that you would have to piece together by looking at other parts of his work, because his main treatment of akrasia is in Nicomachean Ethics, book 7, and in the corresponding material in the Eudemian Ethics. But what he's saying in book 3, Nicomachean Ethics, is directly relevant to that. And the other places where he's talking about our responsibility for our character are germane to that. But Aristotle isn't actually assigning culpability to any, we talk about mechanisms. Aristotle doesn't use that term. So it's better to say causes, right? And among these would be, for example, having a bad syllogism in place. And syllogism doesn't mean like a 3-part, argument. It's a broader term for lines of thinking. Where did you get the line of thinking that tells you that you should eat the cake all the time, that draws you into that, rather than saying, oh, I should, I don't have to taste every sweet thing. How did you get that? Well, that's a question that you can ask yourself. Did it happen because you had bad role models, bad information, because it suited what you wanted to hear? There's a lot of different ways of getting into that. There aren't any like, here's the one way that people go wrong. Aristotle talks about a number of different ways they go wrong with this. All right. Let's see. Zaina says, do you agree with the book by Alexander McGee that Hegel is a Hermetic thinker mostly? No, I think that's a stupid thing to say. And I think that it's attractive to people who love conspiracy theories and thinking they're smarter than everybody else. And, I think Hegel is what Hegel is, a thinker who you work through their works. And, Hegel himself, in a number of places, is very suspicious of mysticism or, that sort of, hidden esoteric doctrine kind of bullshit. But I think people are always attracted to that because it provides them with an in so that they can feel just like people who are attracted to Gnosticism, oh, I'm smarter than everybody else. I have the hidden knowledge. Yeah, I mean, if you're into that, go off and do that in your little corner, but then let the rest of us get on with serious philosophy, I would say. Oh, good. Mark is here. Glad to see you, Mark. All right. Here's another Hegel thing. Bottomhead says, help me get this straight, if you don't mind. Hegel's being needs a negative, something separate from itself in order to constitute itself, creating the beautiful soul syndrome, and this is evil. I think what you're doing there is you're mistaking one little bit for the totality of stuff. It's a mistake generally to take anything in the phenomenology as if this is like Hegel's theory of this. So evil takes a lot of different forms and gets discussed in a lot of different ways in Hegel's works. And the beautiful soul, which is trying to sort of like extricate itself from evil, is just one of those. Um, so I think part of what's going on there is mistaking a part for the whole of what Hegel's doing. Let's see. Kelly has another question. Any thoughts on Aquinas's view of sin as culpable ignorance, choosing without a rule? Isn't even choosing ignorance, choosing evil qua evil? I mean, this is where you're engaging in way too much like high level abstraction and trying to take something that's very complicated and a lot of different distinctions get made of and roll them all into one. Is ignorance always the same thing? You use the same word for it, but is all ignorance the same? Ask yourself that question. And now you start to unravel the problem that you're working with. And, does Aquinas think that all sin is culpable ignorance? That culpable ignorance is choosing without a rule? I don't know where you're getting this interpretation from, but that's better to just read Aquinas straight, but actually read all of what Aquinas has to say on something, because there's different kinds of sins and there's different ways in which we wind up, going astray, right? So I think that will be helpful. Max does have a question. So Max says, I'm curious, are there any other places besides certain parts of Epictetus's discourses and Cicero's On the End where Stoicism idea of the roles and duties we have are discussed? Oh yeah, lots and lots of places. Seneca has all sorts of discussions about different roles and obligations that stem from them running throughout his works, right? I mean, and it's not just the Stoics, by the way. I mean, there's some of this in Plato and Aristotle and their traditions. This is not a uniquely Stoic idea. And I would say that, there's places in Marcus Aurelius as well where he's also, talking about here's what, your role is. And part of it is figuring out like how to negotiate all these different roles that we have, some of which are on the basis of being a human being, some of which are relationships that we've entered into, some are just ones that we kind of inherited, like nobody chose who their parents are, right? Some of them have a more kind of cosmic status to them, you could say, as well. We fit into the common Stoic ideas that we inhabit a commonwealth of human beings and divinities, right? Rational beings. So yeah, this is a idea that runs throughout a lot of Stoic works, you can say. And you could even think that a lot of what goes on with the practical application of the virtues is trying to figure out, okay, what do I actually need to do in this situation, given who I am, in terms of justice? What does justice actually require of me? And sometimes that's going to be, well, you're a husband, so what is a husband supposed to be like? Somebody else, by the way, who would be good for looking at would be Miscellaneous Rufus. We have his lectures, and he talks about a number of different ways of living, right? That are connected with the roles and responsibilities that we have. All right. Gurkham says, I find really dangerous calling people NPCs, but isn't life is fooled when you literally desubjectify life as I don't know. I don't know what you're actually saying here. In religions and Stoicism don't desubjectify life, and I don't even know what you mean by that. So I'm just going to pass on that one. All right, let's see if we've got some other. So Mark asks, what are your thoughts on Oswald Spengler and his cyclical view of history? Do you see his work as relevant today? Any plans to create content on him? So I think Spengler is a third-rate philosopher, and I'm always suspicious of people that are, particularly captivated by him, just as I would be people who are captivated by other third-rate philosophers, like say Ayn Rand, you're like, why are you wasting time on this dreck instead of focusing your time that you have on people who are way better? And I think, with Spengler, the attraction is usually, well, I'm kind of right wing, maybe a bit misanthropic, pessimistic. I'd like to think about, where I fit into things. And then, you get the message and you get these cycles and all that. You can like rail against the degeneracy of your age. I mean, if you're going to do that, why not actually read like a first-rate philosopher like Nietzsche, you know, or somebody else, read some Augustine instead. So do I have plans to shoot videos on him? I mean, I suppose if somebody wanted to pay me to spend my time, which is much more uh, better spent on doing videos on better philosophers, sure, I could do that, but they'd have to pony up because I'm not going to waste my time on Spengler, All right. Ondrej, probably mispronouncing that. How relevant do you think phenomenology and existentialism still is? Well, that's a good question. And it really depends on what you mean by phenomenology, because there isn't just one kind of thing that we call phenomenology. So if you mean like, doing Husserl, I mean, I've always found him kind of boring. Husserl scholars are like a breed apart. But there's people doing interesting work applying his ideas even today. Think about Natalie Depraz and Jean-Luc Marion, right? And there's all sorts of other great phenomenologists out there. I think Max Scheler has a ton to offer, and Edith Stein is pretty interesting. Of course, there's Martin Heidegger. There's a lot of overlap between existentialism and phenomenology. You have Gabriel Marcel, Jean-Paul Sartre, both doing phenomenology. Ortega y Gasset, arguably, doing some of that. Somebody who studied with Husserl, by the way. So it's not something that you can answer without specifying a bit more. I obviously think that existentialism as a movement has a ton to offer because I do classes on it and shoot videos on existentialist thinkers all the time, right? And I do work on some people within the phenomenological movement, like Max Scheler. I did a number of videos on his work, Resentiment, just last fall and winter. Done quite a few on Heidegger, quite a few on Marcel. So, I would say pretty relevant. I'll tell you, every time that you offer a class on existentialism, it'll fill. Students, 18 to 24-year-olds find a lot of the stuff quite relevant today. So I doubt that's ever going to change, really. Bianca says, it's very scary in Europe. We're very worried about what's going to happen. Yeah, I mean, Europeans should be worried because you've got a revanchist Russia trying to, get by on stuff. And whether they deliberately did it or didn't, plan this, they've got a willing dupe in Donald Trump and his administration and all the MAGA Republicans, and there aren't really many other kinds anymore, who have fallen in lockstep behind him. I mean, just look at that poor bastard Rubio and how deflated he looks in that picture going around, knowing he's sold his soul to a chronic corrupt liar, and that he's going to be remembered as a quisling. Now, here's the thing. The Europeans, because America is failing, are going to have to figure out how to provide for their own defense. And they can, there's plenty of people who are willing to fight. Volunteers have been going to Ukraine for years now to fight on their side. You've got somebody like Macron, who's definitely showing some backbone. The French have been, proposing a European defense force now for decades, and it hasn't happened, but now's the time for it to happen, Poland, if Russia wanted to, attack Poland at this point in time, Poland would smear them, and we may see that happen anyway if things get bad enough in Ukraine. But I think it's the point in time now where Europeans do have to come together and ignore the weirdo right wingers like in Slovakia and Hungary, sideline those people, and say we're going to stand up for actual values and put some money and some equipment and some human beings on the line for it. It's what has to happen. Antolon says, speaking of politics, any suggestions on dealing with trolls online who are not being reasonable? Yeah, you don't owe anybody a conversation. If somebody is going to be a troll, you just block them, right? And remove them from your streams, from your whatever it is, your channel, your Substack. You don't have to engage with them. If somebody's in bad faith, it's not your job to fix them. It's their job to learn how to be a decent human being and how to recognize their own failings and to make up for them, So, I block very aggressively. If I see it's not even if somebody is a troll to me. If I see them being a troll to somebody else, I'll block them, And why? Because, time is short. And it's better to devote the resource of time and attention to people that you can actually have a decent conversation with, not people who are liars and cheats and scumbags. And that's what trolls are, They are, and you could say, well, maybe there's some origin story. Well, that's for them to figure out, right? You're not their therapist. You're not their close family member or friend. They're just some online Yahoo who wants to be a jerk. You don't owe them a damn thing. So it's perfectly fine to deal with trolls by saying you're full of crap and then just blocking them. If they want to fix themselves later, they can always get unblocked by coming to you in another channel, another venue, and saying, oh, wow, I was such a jerk. I'm sorry for that. Could you unblock me in YouTube or, Facebook or Twitter, whatever you want to have it in, right? But if somebody is a troll, it's like good mental hygiene to block them, Tony says, with the AP being censored currently, how do we citizens combat the current attack on the media speaking truth to people in power? I'm not aware that the AP is being censored, so I think you might be using that term in a very loose and misleading way. If by that you mean that they're not being invited to press briefings, that's not the same thing as censorship. Censorship is when the government comes in and closes down your printing press or stuff like that, keeps you from being able to disseminate information. Not being forthcoming with information isn't censorship. It's another kind of problem that should be called by a different kind of name, favoritism of right-wing sources, which is what's going on with the Trump administration currently. But how do you combat the current attack on the media? Push back. When you see people saying, ooh, the mainstream media, say you're an idiot, and this is where we actually get real news from, not from Fox News or OAN or whatever the flavor of the day for right-wing kooks is. And you could support media too. And if you actually subscribe and you pay money to help out people who are doing good work, that gives you leverage. Because then, for example, when somebody like Jeff Bezos comes by and buys up the Washington Post and then changes the editorial policies, you can say, screw you, buddy, I'm not paying for this sort of crap anymore. And you pull your dollars out, right? That's how you do it. Rexy Gamer has a kind of tactical question here. How to debunk Marxism easily and defeat socialism in debates using continental or analytic philosophy. Also, how to destroy dialectical materialism completely to debase Marxism from its assumptions. I'm not even interested in that. But it strikes me that using analytic or continental philosophy to try to combat Marxism or socialism, which aren't the same thing, by the way. If you think they are, then maybe you want to actually like learn something about that stuff. You're just going to sound like a nut, and you're not going to convince anybody of anything. You think anybody like, I've got an idea from continental philosophy. By the way, a lot of continental philosophy is in fact, engaging with Marx, right? You think anybody's going to listen to you and not think you're even a bigger kook than some hardcore orthodox Marxist? Or you're going to bring in analytic philosophy and somehow, fix that? No, it doesn't work like that, And if you want to try to destroy dialectical materialism completely, you go right on ahead, man. But like it says in Tristram Shandy, any man can ride his hobby horse as far as he wants, but when he requires me to ride his hobby horse on the King's Road, that's when we have problems. And good luck with your little project there. SJ, nice to see you're still active online. Wish I brought my headphones with me. Yeah, I'm going to be active for quite a while. Maybe another 10, 20, 30 years. I don't have any plans to change things. Hopefully, my health holds out for years to come, and hopefully the platforms that we have like YouTube stick around for a while, right? Let's see here. Yeah, so here's a good question from DPP, a very practical question. When is the next self-directed video coming out? Hopefully this month. I've got a lot of deadline work and a lot of irons in the fire, so I haven't been doing those for a while, but I'm hoping to clear some time and space to be able to get back to doing those. Contingency, what are your thoughts on the concept of some people being philosophical zombies? It's basically the same as somebody being an NPC, right? The idea is that there's no actual consciousness there, but they act as if they had consciousness. I think it's kind of like a lot of things in analytic philosophy. I think it's a reinventing of wheels that have already been much better dealt with by previous philosophers and by speculative fiction. But I understand the literature out there. I don't use that term, right? Because I think it's kind of stupid, but I see what they're trying to drive at. How would you ever know? This is something that Rene Descartes already brings up, right? But he just doesn't have to call it philosophical zombies because he doesn't have to like find a nice catchphrase or something like that, like analytic philosophers unfortunately think they need to. Hobbit, what suggestions would you give a young person who recently started reading philosophical texts and who aspire to become a philosopher themselves one day? Keep reading. And one thing I would say, well, a couple things. So one is, don't assume that the text as you read it the first time is the actual text. If it's any good, there's probably all sorts of features of the text that went by you, and you're going to have to get as you reread it, sometimes as you mature, as you gain more experience. Don't head into texts with lenses on from somebody else's secondary literature or summary of it. If you do, you're probably going to get things mistaken and messed up. So like, for example, people who approach Hegel and they're like, well, I know that Hegel's all about Hegelian dialectics. And I know that Hegelian dialectics is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And then you start reading Hegel and you're like, okay, where's the thesis, antithesis, synthesis? And, Hegel slaps you back and he's like, hey, you dummy, I didn't say that. That's this idiot over here who's claiming that. That's not my actual work. Or if you already know about Plato and his idealism because you've read some, encyclopedia articles or something like that. And then you actually read Platonic dialogues and you're like, what the hell's going on here? Well, you came in with blinders on. So I'm not saying don't ever read secondary literature, but realize that you're always getting somebody's take, right? You're not getting the straight stuff. And the more simple and cool and attractive the secondary literature take is, the more likely it's going to be a deformation of what's actually being said. You want the boring commentators like Friedrich Cobbleston's History of Philosophy, right? He doesn't have axes to grind the way that, say, Bertrand Russell does, who often gets people wrong, right? In his History of Philosophy, which is very fun and freewheeling, but often off base, right? So you want the boring commentators like myself too. I try to be, I just want to explain the philosopher in a sympathetic way. I'm not interested in saying, and here's how they fit into this grand scheme or something like that. So that's a second thing. I think a third thing might be, you want to be a philosopher. Well, you got to think about, what you're nourishing yourself with. Just like if you want to be a good writer, you got to read good literature, right? If you want to be a good thinker in terms of philosophy, you got to read quite a few people. And it's not, again, going back to the gamification thing, there's way too much emphasis on I'm going to master Plato and then I'm going to master Aristotle. No, man, you're not going to master any of those because you're not going to go to one level or another. There's no leveling up or anything, any of these game metaphors. You just got to plow through it, stick with it, do the hard work, So, all right. Q says, never in my life did I think that I'd be reading books in my late 20s and listening to Gregory on YouTube every day. Thanks for great teaching. Stoicism really put the best version of me. Well, that's great. And there's other good, people out there doing good work, so we're kind of in a lucky, fortunate time in that we've got so many resources. I think one of the big challenges is figuring out who we should devote our time to, right? Nimash, are you still planning to do a half-hour series on Descartes' meditations? Yeah, I am. I got to figure out how I would set up, something like the half-hour Hegel project for funding to do it, because it's going to be pretty intensive. I've got the tools I need. I've got Descartes' meditations in both French and Latin with this nice Presse Universitaire de France edition. I've got the, standard scholarly edition. I've got Gilson's Index Scholastico-Cartesian and, some other things that would be helpful for it. It's a matter of finding the time, which is, that's where the funding has to come in, because doing that takes away from other things, how I earn my living, right? Theodore says, do you have any thoughts on Alex O'Connor, the new atheist big shot on YouTube? I've never even heard of him, but I don't get involved in those atheist Christian debates. I find most of the people involved in them, for one thing, usually haven't studied very much. So it's not worth my time to even, watch them. Second, they often argue in bad faith. They're people who are crusaders, secularist crusaders and Christian crusaders. And they're not very interested, most of them, in any sort of truth of things. So I don't know who that is. I don't pay attention to that stuff. 19 Blue, you mentioned third-rate philosophers. How would somebody know they're third-rate without engaging with their works? How do you know to avoid them before you waste your time? Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's nothing that says you can't read third-rate philosophers. I actually read them and sometimes teach them. If I'm teaching a standard ethics class, Ayn Rand is a third-rate philosopher, in part because she's, when it comes to other philosophers, she's terrible. She doesn't know Kant. She doesn't even know Aristotle, who she gets wrong and thinks he's a wonderful, guy. But she's worth teaching because a lot of people read her stuff, and because she's a sort of decent representative of a rational egoist position. So I'll teach her, right? And then the reason to teach her is so that the students can see that her stuff isn't very good. But so it's not as if you have to avoid them, but why would you want to become a Randian or a Spenglerian? That would be kind of sad, wouldn't it? It would be sort of like saying, I've got this decent athletic talent, and I could maybe be good at, playing soccer or hockey or, running track. And instead I'm going to really get good at tiddlywinks, or jacks. I hope that becomes a competitive sport that I can go to the Olympics for, playing some kids game like that. You'd be like, what the hell are you doing? What's wrong with you? Or if you had some musical talent and instead of playing the piano or the guitar, or even, the clarinet, you're like, you know what I'm going to do, man? I'm going to play the triangle. I'm going to get really good at ding, ding, ding. Why would you waste your time with that sort of stuff? And, how can you tell if somebody's third rate? I mean, it's there's no one single answer to that, but one would be to look at, what do other people say about them? I mean, it's interesting with Ayn Rand, it's usually the line in academia is she's not even a philosopher. But, you could actually read people who take her seriously and see, they're not like Randians, and see what they have to say, The same thing with Spengler or other people who are, kind of culty figures, but don't measure up. And is there any one single person to go to for that? No, unfortunately not. And sometimes you do have to waste some time reading people who turn out to be not very good. And that's just the way it works sometimes, Let's see. Gurkham says, when you look at the advancement of science, do you think process ontology is superior compared to others? I'm convinced by British empiricism and Descartes' dualism. I'm not a philosopher of science, and I think most scientists don't care at all about philosophy. So, and what constitutes advancement of science? That's a real abstraction there. Process ontology, well, which one are you talking about? Are you talking about Whitehead, who's very interesting, but very tough to make sense of? I actually think process and reality is a more difficult work than Hegel's phenomenology, quite frankly. Or are you talking about Hartshorne? Are you talking about more recent people? It's not like they're all on exactly the same page. And hey, if you find that British empiricism, whatever the hell that means to you, I mean, are you a Humean? Are you a Reedian? Are you talking about something Bertrand Russell derived? Or I don't know. You're going to combine that with Descartes' dualism? Well, good luck with that. So I don't have a great answer to that. What are your thoughts on John Milbank and the postmodern theology? I think there's no such thing as the postmodern theology. I would say that there's a lot of different things that are late modern, that some people might call postmodern, that incorporate theology, and that there's a whole bunch of them, right? I mean, you could actually say that Derrida is doing some of that in some of his late work, right? Where he's turning to religion. Milbank, I think, is become a clown. I don't take him seriously. I actually blocked him on Twitter because I've seen him say so many stupid things that I don't want him cluttering up my stream. I think he and a lot of the radical orthodoxy people are basically ideologues who were interesting 25 years ago, but have almost nothing to offer at present. So, that's what I would say. Bottomhead, what's your take or takedown of JD Vance? I mean, I don't have to do a takedown. I think that's kind of dumb language. Again, that's that sort of gamification crap, ooh, we're going to fight the big boss, I mean, I think Vance is, if you know his history, he's a fraud, right? He has relatives that are from Appalachia. He wrote a book that made him famous, but he's from the elites. He went to, an elite school. He capitalized on that. He, found his way in, mascara and everything, into being a vice presidential candidate that even most of the people in his party were like, this idiot, you brought him in. And, he wants to present himself as being a tough guy, but he's actually a big wuss, I mean, he's the kind of guy who I think me and a lot of other people would love to see talking smack in a dark alley somewhere and, settle a score. He's the kind of guy who, pretends a lot of things, and he's a fake Christian. That's very clear. He doesn't have any backbone. I mean, is that a takedown? I mean, these are things you can easily find just by watching the guy. So, and people like him are like that as well, all right. So here's a good question from EA8Y. Do I like reading? I think you can probably assume, since I have all sorts of books, and you can see like bookshelves there, and that I do a lot of talking about books that I've read and authors that I've read that I enjoy reading. Yes. So there you go. Let's see. Blank. How would an assessment of the implications of the past 24 hours differ between run-of-the-mill historians versus philosophers versus psychologists? I mean, I don't know what a run-of-the-mill historian is, so I don't think I can actually answer that, but there's a lot of overlap between philosophy, history, and psychology, isn't there? THS, I used to go by the username Neo. I would like to ask if you had any experience with observing paintings and which art movement reflects on your philosophy the most. Well, there isn't any like art movement that connects with what I'm interested in philosophy the most, but I do like, art, but I'm not somebody super knowledgeable about it. I have some favorite paintings. I'm fortunate that one of them is here in Milwaukee, and I can go see it, more or less when I want to, because we're still art museum members, and it's the Midgard by Anselm Kiefer. And it's kind of a cool piece. You can look it up, just Google it, and you can see what it looks like. Although we're going to actually most likely be reconsidering whether we're going to be members of the art museum, given that they have been paying their director way, way too much money, enough that it's actually like the county is doing an investigation into them, and they've been cutting staff, and we don't like that. So, yeah. Sam, which medieval commentary on Aristotle's categories do you like the most? None of them, because I don't care about Aristotle's categories or medieval commentaries on them very much, you know? So it's kind of a loaded question. It's assuming that I actually spend much time looking at commentaries on Aristotle's categories. Diogenes says, how would you rank the Platonic dialogues in terms of your own personal enjoyment? Huge fan of the Timaeus currently and Schelling's commentary on it. Okay, so that's a good question. I don't know that I have a favorite Platonic dialogue. There's some that I teach frequently, and I generally teach them because I think they're worth having students engaging with those dialogues. And I also enjoy rereading them. And then there's some that I don't teach very often, but I enjoy thinking about and engaging with as well. And it's kind of changed over time, you know. I would say that like when I was younger, I was more attracted to like, give me the really, really heavy metaphysics, man. You know, so like, of course, the Republic and the you know, late dialogues, like, well, the Timaeus would be in there, but also like the Statesman and the Sophist, Parmenides. Although I do find the dialectic in the Parmenides kind of boring to go through. And over time, you know, the symposium was a big one for me as well. I actually spent an entire semester going through it in Greek with a classics professor when I was a graduate student. But I kind of like things like the Protagoras now and the Gorgias and, you know, those sorts of dialogues. What else? You know, I mean, I always like teaching the Phaedo. The Phaedo, by the way, whenever I get to that death scene at the end, emotionally, it always hits me just like Albert Camus' The Plague does. You know, I end up kind of weepy and stuff like that, which is kind of a cool thing that a book can still affect me. I'm not jaded or anything, right? So, yeah, I would say those are some of the dialogues that I particularly get into, right? Let's see here. Oh, MM is recommending Duns Scotus's commentary on the categories. Yeah, I mean, anybody can like anything, I guess. Fanny, I asked a few years ago about the Nietzsche podcast. You said you hadn't heard of it, but now you were part of an episode. How do you feel about the podcast? I think it's fine. It's a podcast, right? It's by somebody who's much more into Nietzsche than I am, obviously, because he created a Nietzsche podcast. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of things where somebody will approach me and say, hey, can you come on to my show or podcast? And I haven't heard of them originally. And then, you know, I go and do it. I actually just answered one similar request earlier today that somebody reached out to me. They're starting a new podcast. They've interviewed a couple people and they're like, would you come on next? And I was like, yeah, sure. Why not? Right. Socrates' great grandson. I finished my BA in philosophy last spring, and I'm now fulfilling the prerequisites to enter an MS in artificial intelligence this fall. Do you think philosophy? Oh, it's a great question. Do you think philosophy is a good springboard into other fields? Yes and no. It depends on what philosophy you studied and how you studied it. So if you're like overly, my philosophy is the best thing in the world, whether it's like, you know, this historical movement or cutting edge continental or analytic philosophy, if you go in and you're like, I'm the one who's the big thinker and I'm going to teach all of you, that's not going to fly. That's like the old Beatles line. If you go around carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you're not going to make it with anyone anyhow, right? Philosophy does, though, give you, if you're studying it well, it gives you certain habits of mind. Like, you know, what are our advantages? Why do philosophers do well in lots of other fields? One is we learn how to make distinctions well, right? not just for the sake of making distinctions, but because they help us pragmatically when we run into problems. We're also good at thinking about like, what are the assumptions that are in play and what implications do they have? That's something a lot of people aren't very good at either. And then we often do think outside of disciplinary boundaries. So, you bring in a philosopher into a business setting. The marketing people have all gone to school and they got their, BAs or MBAs and they know exactly how to do it, but maybe they haven't adequately thought about their field. Or I've worked with like psychologists and people in the legal profession, business people, artists and designers, medical people, all of which, I could contribute to some degree to what it is that they're thinking about and studying. Sometimes it's even just saying like, hey, you've got this all figured out, but have you thought about this, right? So I think, yeah, it can be a good springboard, but you're not going to like take Descartes or Hegel or Hume or pick whoever else and then like directly apply it within that field that you're working in. All right. THS, the famous painting Wandering Above the Sea of Fog, highlights the notion of the sublime. Yeah, okay. That's great. Doomstark, do you see a current sublation of the God is dead era? I think we're going back philosophically to Hegel and re-examining Nietzsche and Marx and trying a different way than what secular humanists have. I don't see that at all. I think that Hegel is interesting, but I don't buy into his developmental model of history. I think that, there's a lot of developments that Hegel never conceived of, and I don't know that using Hegel is going to be all that helpful. Levi, can you talk about McIntyre's critique of analytic philosophy in the postscript to the second edition of After Virtue and his agreement with philosophers like Lewis, Rorty, and Inwagen? No, because I haven't looked at that for a long time. That's very, very specific. His critiques of analytic philosophy can be found throughout his works, and he's somebody who did it from the inside, right? He was an analytic philosopher for a long time. And, they're along the lines of like, it's largely irrelevant. They've made themselves largely irrelevant to discourse in the present. And, they tend to promote a certain sort of approach to things. But analytic philosophy, you got to realize, doesn't name one single thing. It's just like with continental philosophers, lots of different movements and traditions within it. And so whatever McIntyre is talking about in 1950 or in 1970 or in 1984 may not be the analytic philosophy of the present, right? So Filio just wanted to stop in and say thank you for taking so much of your time to explain Hegel. I'm not finished with the series yet, but I'm loving it. That's great to hear. And, I am not the perfect person to have done the series. I'm just the person who chose to put in the work to do it. There's much better Hegel scholars out there than me who could have done it, but, I don't think that too many people are interested in giving that amount of time, particularly traditional academics. I think most of them don't see that much value in commentary videos, unless they're things like being asked to do the great courses or something like that, And all right, well, here's a good question. Eli, I'm trying to start a philosophy club at my community college. Do you have any tips or advice about running a philosophy club? Yeah, so a couple things. One is you want to realize that it's going to be a hard sell and it'll probably take a while to get traction, but you just got to keep at it, and keep trying things and drawing people in. You probably will have a few cranks and trolls, and you got to figure out what you're going to do with them so that they don't here's one way to approach it. You say, listen, this club is not just for you and the discussion that you want to engage in, it's for all of us. And so, let's say you get somebody in there who wants to talk about, alpha, beta, gamma, male, that sort of stuff. You can be like, listen, that's got nothing to do with the topic for today, which is Kierkegaard's Night of Faith, and you can find another club over there to do that stuff in. We're going to concentrate on this. The other thing is I would, it's a community club, or it's a community college. So you are going to have students who are not going to be philosophy majors, right? Because you probably don't have a philosophy program at a community college. It's part of the gen ed stuff. But, you want to draw people in. So you got to be thinking about philosophy in a broad sense. And you may have local community members. It wouldn't hurt to put up like flyers in your local community, and to put something on Facebook or in other places to drive awareness of what you're doing, right? DPP, how to balance multiple difficult fields like theoretical physics, mathematics, and also philosophy. Find it literally impossible. Is it even possible to bring them on the same ground yet again? Same ground? Probably not, because there are three different disciplines. You got to like figure out what you want to do. I mean, I would love to be able to be great at music and have time for doing the artwork that I used to do when I was much younger, but I'm doing other stuff instead. So sometimes you can't have it all, So Ondrej says, would you say there's a big advantage of studying philosophy at the university, or is it the type of subject you can study on your own without much trouble? There is no right answer to that. It depends on a couple of factors. One is like, what kind of student are you? Are you somebody who benefits from the structure of an academic discipline? Somebody who needs a lot of guidance? Are you more, self-starting? What's your university like? There are some places where you'd study philosophy and they're not very good at it, or my professors were actually pretty bad when I was an undergrad. But I was a very, self-motivated person. So I read a lot that they didn't actually suggest that I read, and had a lot of great conversations with people outside of my discipline about things that were philosophical. So it depends on a lot of factors. There's no easy, straightforward answer to that, I would say. Jermaine, do you think texts like Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty have any value as introductions to different areas or topics of philosophy, or are they just too broad in their scope? I actually think that Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty is a great essay. It doesn't cover everything, right? And there's some objections that you can raise to it, but it's thoughtful and helps to put a lot of things into perspective. And I down the line, I actually want to do some core concept videos on it when I have the time. So that's a good one. You could incorporate that into a lot of different classes. That could be good for an intro class too. Socrates' great grandson, can you maintain intense focus for extended periods of time, like when reading or studying? If so, for how long? Maintaining a consistent sleep schedule and hefty doses of caffeine to help me out. Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, some of that is also habit, right? You do it just like with any other job, you get pretty good at doing that kind of job. If you don't do it for a while, you kind of lose those intellectual muscles. So yeah, how long? It depends on what I'm studying, and how many other things I've got drawing on my time. Because I also have a life and I have a body, If I'm sick, it's tougher. If a lot of things are going on in my life with my family or other things that I'm involved in, probably not as much focus. So, let's see. So Frilio, at one point I thought of myself as an anti-objectivist, if there is such a thing. I didn't read Rand though. I just know that she's right-wing libertarian and they're fun to debate. Well, I mean, that seems pretty silly to me, frankly. If you you don't really know much about her, just knowing that she's a right-wing libertarian, and you can't be anti something without actually knowing what you're being anti with. All right, Doomstark. We the Living is very good. Opened my eyes to how harsh communist Russia was and how something like that happens. Yeah, I mean, in matters of taste, as the saying goes. Let's see here. Not so Oedipus. Do you still want to write a book about recent French philosophy, separating the good from the bad? I mean, more talking about what's good in particular philosophers' work. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. Do I have the time to do all the book projects that I want to do? No. I mean, if somebody like created a chair for me somewhere, then that could happen, but I'm pretty busy. Claes Philip, I've never heard you mention Albert Schweitzer. Have you read him? Any opinion on his ethics? Yeah, I mean, I've read him, both in terms of his ethics of reverence for life, but also in terms of, I used to teach classes on the canonical and non-canonical gospels in a religious studies class. And we would, of course, talk about, his stuff on the quest for the historical Jesus. So yeah, I've read Schweitzer. I don't consider his ethics particularly workable. I sometimes teach it, but teach it kind of at the very beginning of the semester is like, well, here's one way of thinking about altruism. See if you could actually apply this, right? So Filio, is philosophy these days just cultural studies in the sciences? Philosophy is a million different things. We've never been in a time where there are more ways of doing philosophy. So any sort of like philosophy is just this, that's going to be from a very limited viewpoint, right? Now, the college that you're applying for no longer offers philosophy as a major. I mean, that's a lot of places, right? Including some places that I've worked for in the past, Greg says, if I don't like working for someone, is it a contradiction if I hire somebody? No, that's, and is this a chiasmus? I don't know what you mean by chiasmus there. Usually that's a rhetorical figure. But if you don't like working for someone else, you don't like working for that person. That's one thing over here. And then hiring somebody, that's another thing over here. There's no inherent contradiction between them. Thrown away, how does Deleuze's metaphysics go wrong? Do you think the metaphysics could be described as provisionally valid? What is problematic about his Stoicism take, his response to Lacan? So a lot of different questions there. Does Deleuze actually have a real metaphysics? Yeah, kind of. He's all over the map. There's that notion of the rhizome, which everyone talks about as if like that's something radically new, which I don't think it actually is. A lot of late 20th century French philosophy is very, very confined to like, and here's why this thing over here is wrong and why I'm offering something in addition to it. I think that with Deleuze, so like not just the Stoicism, but Deleuze's take on Hume or Spinoza or Leibniz. Deleuze is like Heidegger. You're going to get some really interesting takes on historical figures, but it's going to be 60% Deleuze and 40% attention to those historical figures. So you don't go to Deleuze for Stoicism. Actually, you don't even go to Foucault for that, who's a more careful reader, because he also, will get things wrong by way of emphasis and stuff like that. Eli, how have you been able to find a good church given the prevalence of fundamentalist Christianity in America? So fundamentalists are not really a big deal if you're using the word in the proper sense. If you mean something more like conservative, literal approaches to the Bible, now that's different, but that's not the same thing as fundamentalism in the rigorous sense of the term. And that's kind of not that much of an issue for me, because, you know, if I wanted to like go to a mainstream Protestant church, they're not fundamentalist by any means, right? It just so happens, unfortunately, they're kind of dying. So it's kind of a non-starter, right? Uh, so what do you think of object-oriented ontology? I thought it made me think, didn't do much for me afterward. I think that's a great take on it. I think that, object-oriented ontology was a big thing about like 15 years ago. Just like we were talking about radical orthodoxy. People were like, this is a big thing. And a lot of these big things turn out to be not really that new or interesting, right? So I've actually met Graham Harmon and got to talk to him a little bit, and frankly wasn't that impressed. And I think that what they were saying was, maybe interesting, but it's not as if they were like giving us a totally new perspective or something like that. All right. Jaco Pasto, I'm doing a PhD in anthropology. I'm realizing the more I read, the lesser I feel sure of the world. And in some ways, my existential dread is increased. I feel like I know nothing. Okay, so that's a common experience, right? And it can happen in all sorts of fields. And it's kind of normal, you know? It's a sign of becoming aware of just how much is out there in terms of like theory and the disconnect between theory and what you're actually experiencing. You don't have to feel existential dread about it. Although, that's certainly one possibility. You could feel joy at, the many different possibilities of thinking about perspectives, or you could treat it in a neutral way. It doesn't have to go down that direction. So you might want to think about why that fills you with dread. The feeling like you don't know anything, you do know a lot of stuff. You just don't know the totality of things, and that's what you wanted to do, right? All right. The soulless Shike, what do you think about eating meat? I think that there's nothing absolutely intrinsically wrong with eating meat. We are a omnivore and predator creature. That's why we got our eyes in the front. We were persistence hunters. I would also say that our modern ways of meat production are pretty inhumane. Factory farming is an ethical travesty, but it is possible to have ethically sourced meat if you want to pay extra money for it, right? So, we're in a household where we eat fish, and at least for the time being, chicken and turkey, but we don't eat pork and beef and stuff like that. I will sometimes still eat pork and beef if we're out at a restaurant, but my wife doesn't, and I'm cool with that, I also want to say too that animals that need to eat meat, like cats, it's terrible to try to make them vegan because you want to be a vegan or something like that. Let's see here. Blank, what percentage of your book collection do you estimate is about philosophy? What do you think the genre breakdown might be for your remaining books? I don't know. That's a good question. I would say that probably at least half of my books are philosophy in one sense or another. And then a lot of the other books are literature of one form or another. A lot of speculative fiction stuff, but a lot of classic literature as well. Some history stuff, some other books about other things, like I got my language books. Looking around on my shelves, yeah, a lot of it is, maybe even 60% is philosophy, I would say. Ooh, really interesting hypothetical question here from not an academic. if you could choose to have prevented the death of a philosopher from ancient times and the 18th century onward, who would they be? Whether to finish their work or see where their ideas would develop. So a weird kind of restriction, ancient times or 18th century onward. So that would rule out Blaise Pascal, who unfortunately died young. And it would also rule out Boethius, who had this really interesting project that probably would have changed intellectual history in the West of translating all of Plato and Aristotle's works into Latin. But you've said just ancient or 18th century onward. So 18th century onward, I mean, somebody who comes to mind is Søren Kierkegaard, right? He dies pretty young. It'd be interesting to see what he would have developed into. I mean, Nietzsche, if he hadn't had his mental breakdown, maybe he would have written a lot more. That's a good question. I'd have to think about that a bit more. Yeah. Nima asks, do you think Meursault, so the fictional character in Camus' The Stranger, represents absurdism or nihilism? He represents a certain attitude that the absurd man can take, as Camus talks about it in the Myth of Sisyphus. Camus has also said in interviews that Meursault is basically an asshole, you know? I don't think that he represents nihilism. He represents one way absurdism could go, but not a direction that Camus would actually suggest you should go, right? Siddharth Das, would you rather read or write philosophy? I mean, why not both? I don't see why I can't do both and also, do videos about it. Blank asks, what disciplines do you think are most philosophy adjacent? Which ones have the greatest proximity? Well, I don't think any discipline is, by virtue of being that discipline, most philosophy adjacent. It depends on how the discipline is being done, right? And it's good to note, too, that there's a lot of authors and movements that could be considered philosophical, depending on what your idea of philosophy is, or could be considered literary or psychological. So it's not like these are boxes that are like, spatially located next to each other. Joshua says, do you have any work on metaethics? Yeah, I've talked about quite a few thinkers who qualify as metaethics. Frankly, I think metaethics is bullshit. And I think it's for the same reason that meta language always turns out to be language. The people who were really big on meta ethics and who push it nowadays, they want to say, well, there's meta ethics up here, and then there's like whatever you're going to call it, like normative ethics, descriptive ethics, prescriptive ethics, blah, 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 blah. But what you find is that these are people who haven't read enough, because what you find when you look at every substantive, traditional thinkers, movements, approaches, they're already doing meta ethics. What people up here are calling meta ethics. Utilitarians have good reasons why they say everybody's really either doing utilitarianism or doing something opposed to it. That's meta ethics. Kant, in examining where do other people go wrong, meta ethics, right? And every supposed above it all meta ethics always turns out to have some normative implications and oftentimes like statements within it, right? We should, we're a motivist, so therefore we should behave like a motivist, and everybody should be a motivist. It's no longer just a description of ethics. It's like telling you what you ought to do. So I think that the distinction between whatever you want to call the lower tier and then meta ethics actually it breaks down. So here's a good question. As a matter of law, for someone wanting to understand the current political climate in the U.S. currently, would the Frankfurt School be a good starting point? Probably not. I mean, it kind of depends on who you're thinking about. Do you mean Habermas? He might be useful because he's actually a good bit closer in time. He's still alive, actually. Would, Horkheimer and Adorno's the authoritarian, or no, Adorno, I think, just by himself, right? The authoritarian personality be of use? Yeah, to some degree. I mean, a lot of that's pretty dated. Would Marcuse's stuff be very helpful? I don't know. Would Adorno's aesthetic theory or minima moralia apply? Probably not, Let's see here. Matt Gilbert, which philosopher or philosophical school do you think has been the most misunderstood or misread? Wow, that's a tough one. I don't know. I mean, really any important philosophical school or thinker has got people who've gotten mixed up about them. That's the part that trips you up, right? Singling out one. I don't know that I can do that. So, Kamau 84, top 3 fictional philosophical books. Yeah, I don't know about that either. I mean, I can tell you who I really like. I think if you followed me for any amount of time, you know that I really like Philip K. Dick and Ursula K. Le Guin. And, there's books by Dostoevsky I like quite a bit. Obviously, I like Borges quite a bit, but he doesn't write books. He writes collections of short stories. I've also recently gotten into, and when I say recently, like in the last 4 years, Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is this massive, sprawling, I hesitate to even call it epic fantasy series because I think that it's beyond epic in the way that it construes things. I'm going to be writing about that later this year, actually. And I've had some great conversations with Jimmy Nuts about that. Somebody, by the way, whose channel I recommend, the Fantasy Network. He's really good on speculative fiction. And Malazan Book of the Fallen is a 10-book series, each of which is anywhere from 650 to 1,000 pages long, and it's so rich and dense. Is that a book? It's Malazan Book of the Fallen. I mean, that could fit in there. So it's tough to say. Bianca asked, what's your biggest takeaway from Stoicism? I mean, kind of a takeaway that you also get from other intentional modes of living, or as we call them, philosophies as ways of life. They all have in common, whether it's Platonist, Aristotelian, Stoic, early Christian, they all have in common the idea that we are not just pawns of fate or determined by our conditioning or biology, but we can actually rationally look at ourselves and say, man, I'm messed up. Wouldn't I like to be less messed up? How can I do that? So that's probably the biggest takeaway, that's possible. Good to see you here, Ken. I was listening to Sun and Steel by Iron Maiden earlier. That's off the Peace of Mind album, by the way, for those who are interested in where to find it. And it struck me it's about the book of the same name by Mishima. I was wondering if you'd ever read it. No, I never have. And it's an interesting song, isn't it? Because Peace of Mind, it's got a lot of really great songs on it, right? That's one of the songs that people sometimes say, I don't know if I like that one that much. It hasn't aged that well. I think it's a great song, I'm trying to think. I mean, some people don't like the Dune themed To Tame a Land, which is also pretty awesome too. It's like 7 minutes long and some really cool stuff happening in that song. Um, yeah. So, all right. Let's see. We're gonna have to get going pretty soon, so I can have a little bit to eat before I do my philosophy chat. Um, Dark Wizard asks, what do you make of Mill's footnote on intention? How do you make sense of his distinction between motivation and intention? I'm not sure where that is, so I don't have anything to say about that. Not so Oedipus. Have you ever delved into British idealism? Bradley Alexander, Boson Kett, McTaggart, Green, people like that. Yeah, I mean, delved but not deeply, I think you can say. You know, I think what they have to say is interesting, but I don't spend much time on them. Um, let's see here. So here's an interesting question. John Flemings, if you had complete control over the philosophy curriculum and the places you teach, what changes would you implement? Um, I mean, the places that I teach are Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, which doesn't have a philosophy program, right? I'm just part of the humanities part of the critical studies department. And I kind of get to offer what I want to offer there. I mean, I really do need, if I'm going to stay there long term, I really, really need to put together an aesthetics class, a philosophical aesthetics class. But I'm not an expert in that field. So there's a good bit of work I need to do in order to do that. The other place that I teach, not as often, but fairly regularly, is Marquette University. And they actually have like a graduate program in philosophy, which has in recent years, they used to have some really significant strength in history of philosophy, and that's been eroding over the years as they switch much more to like, social political philosophy, fairly recent stuff, and I would say they probably need to like bring back some of the strength in history of philosophy that they used to have. Um, they also screwed up with the core, right? They went from a lot of, and this is very common in Catholic higher ed, right? They're always shrinking the core because the professions who shouldn't be in charge basically run the universities. And so they always want there to be less required classes. So it used to be if you went to a Catholic school, you were probably going to get 2 or 3 philosophy and 2 or 3 theology classes just required. And they've shrunk it now to there being basically just this thing we call foundations of philosophy rather than, in an intro class and then an ethics class. I think that was a mistake. I think that, I'd expand the offerings and stuff like that. So, here's an interesting question. ZX, what would you say is the personality type that America represents today? Are we in an age of personalities that like to punish? Well, if America was a person, it would be a person who's deeply divided against itself and, very lucky, but also lazy and entitled and kind of oblivious to what's going on in a lot of other places. We do have a lot of people who like to punish, who are cruel. I don't think that's really that new. If you lived through the 1980s, you saw plenty of those types as well. So I don't know that it's like radically new, but I'll say this on the Democrat side, they are now effectively centrist. There's really not much traditional left about them. They don't really look out for workers and stuff like that. On the side of the right, what we used to view as just the lunatic fringe, they've taken over, and they do like to punish. All right, let's see if we've got something else I can go out on. Oh, so this is a great one. So we're back in the realm of heavy metal again. I'll answer this, then I'm going to have to go and get something to eat. So, blank, thoughts on Dio, Ronnie James Dio, musically and thematically. Ronnie James Dio is one of the most powerful voices ever in heavy metal. He was a very intelligent man, very thoughtful. I love watching interviews with him and seeing what he has to say about stuff, because he's reflected on things. He's worked really hard. He was somebody who could be very humble and realistic. He'd be like, I learned so much from Richie Blackmore. I learned so much from being in Black Sabbath. Here's what the lessons that I learned from them about showmanship. But he's also somebody who knew the importance of connecting with an audience. It was like an ethical principle for him. Don't screw them over. Don't view them as just like a bunch of suckers to pay for your lifestyle. That's a problem with a lot of musicians, I think. And you watch concerts with Dio, and he was like always on, always trying to make sure everybody was not just having a good time, but like it was an experience. His lyrical abilities are pretty amazing. Something that you might not know about Ronnie James Dio, though, is that he actually could play all the instruments. He could play guitar, he could play keyboards, he could play drums. He didn't do that because he was the front man and the singer. But when I've actually met people who worked with Dio, and they were amazed, because he would be like, hey, this is what I want to hear on the guitar. And he'd pick up a guitar and he'd play it, and he'd be like, can you do that? And they'd be like, yeah, or something like that, and here's how the drums need to sound, and he'd get behind the kit and start, drumming away. So he was just a really impressive musician. I can't think of anybody who I would say had the range of talent that Ronnie James Dio actually had. I can think of people who came close, who, also combined being thoughtful, knowing a lot, being able to put together really good compositions, but none of them actually, I think, wind up being like him. And the music that they've created isn't as good as the music that he's done. Now, that said, right? Judas Priest, Iron Maiden as ensembles, Dio's band as an ensemble, you can put them all, toe to toe against each other. And you could say, in Iron Maiden, Steve Harris he doesn't have the role that Dio did in his own band, but Steve Harris is pretty damn important, chief songwriter for much of their time, band leader, amazing bassist, right? Great lyricist as well. And, as a person, I would say they're like on the same level, but in terms of the centrality of that, I would say Dio is more central. So this is an interesting thing to think about. And I think a lot of people don't often get into those sorts of discussions. So, all right. Well, actually, I do have to answer one other thing, since somebody's putting up some money in a super chat. Poundian aesthete. Do you have any thoughts on the influence of Meister Eckhart on Heidegger's philosophy? You're going to be unfortunately disappointed. I don't have much thoughts on that. There's people who allege that, but I don't really see it that way. I think that Heidegger is kind of doing his own interesting thing. And this goes back to like the question about mysticism at the very beginning with like Hegel's philosophy. I don't focus on figures like that much. And I actually had a good friend who actually had me translating some old, some was it Middle High German Eckhart, to help him out because he was an Eckhart scholar. But I'm just not into that sort of stuff. So, all right. Actually, I'll answer one other thing too, really quick before I go. So Miguel says, I recall your cat died a number of months ago, actually years ago. I'm wondering if you've adopted another cat since then. I have not. I volunteer at a cat shelter, and my wife, since our last cat died, has become much more allergic. So there's no prospect of bringing cats home. As a matter of fact, when I come home from the shelter, I actually take my shirt off, put it into the wash right away, because she's so allergic that, like, if I hug her, she'll start to, get a little bit asthmatic. I get my cat fix by going in and helping out the cats at Almost Home. So actually, I'll put in a plug for them too. You may have seen in my YouTube channel and other places that I'm going to be going to this event, karaoke, in next week, not next week, the week after that. And if I'm doing a fundraiser, if I raise $100 for the shelter, I'll do some singing and we'll record it and post it somewhere. So that could be kind of cool. All right, so that is it for today. I didn't get to everybody's questions, unfortunately, but can't get to everything. Come next time. We've got a lot of cool events lined up this month. I'm going to be doing a talk as part of the Plato's Academy Center conference on anger, psychology, and philosophy. I'm going to be on Acid Horizon. I'm going to be doing a couple other things as well. So I will see all of you down the line, and thanks for popping in.